Good evening, sir. We
Good
welcome you
evening.
to the second edition of Bhagidari Sahitya Utsav, and we are really glad to have you here. So, as you are a poet, the first question for me is that how did you realize that your expression, the medium of your expression is poetry, and how did you start writing it?
I guess my rite of passage was pretty similar to a lot of poets that I have heard about and I admire. It happened to be the great coincidence of having a good teacher. So, in my education during my university years in Hindu College in Delhi University, where I did my bachelor's long ago, there was one teacher called Lalita Subbu. And she was just one of those teachers who was special to each one of us. And she found potential in each one of us. She was the one who would take your poem, undergraduate scribblings that they were. She could take it and color them red and give edits. And over long sessions, over cups of coffee, she would take your writing seriously. And if she would take it so seriously, then you began to take yourself seriously as well. And Lalita Subbu was one of those teachers who she made dancers out of those who wanted to become dancers. She made musicians out of those who wanted to become musicians. She made writers out of those who wanted to become writers. And so many of the people across generations sort of owe that to her. She passed away a few years ago. No, now more than a decade ago. And at her funeral, we all realized that each one of us thought that we had that special relationship with her. So she was one of those who made us feel like that. And I think that great serendipity of a good teacher sometimes makes a big
Yeah,
difference.
that push basically.
Yes.
So, like, I read your poem. It was in Shimla, and I just recall the name Lalita there.
That was the teacher indeed. I'm so glad you read that
I really like that.
because it was written years after her passing away, and there's a way in which Lalita will always remain that young image in my mind, as the last time I saw her. And so there are so many years later as well, one goes back to her constantly. There are so many moments in which one is again full of gratitude. There are so many moments in which one wants to ape her, become like her, because I am also a teacher.
Yes,
So
yes.
at least in small moments, if not being able to inhabit her full persona. So she was just one of those.
So, like, after reading in Shimla, it was basically a poem about longing, remembering, and grief. So, do you really feel like all of these feelings are important for expressing in poetry?
I mean, so technically, poetry subject matter can be whatever kind. If you read lyric poetry, it's largely the voices of one person and the subject matter is, the scope is of emotions, feelings, affect. But there's epic poetry as well. I mean, you would have the Homer's epics,
Almost,
and
yes.
in which wars are being fought. If you read even like poetry up till the 18th century, there are like talking about Whigs and Tories and political fights.
Political
And
fights.
so, lyric poetry, particularly, is where this kind of voice emerges, which is very sensitive to emotional feelings and any kind of fluctuations in those feelings. Uh, I do think that kind of poetry produces, at least my hope is, it produces a softer individual, it produces a more sensitive individual, it produces an individual who is not bombastic or is capable of frightening certitude, which we have a lot of around us.
Around us.
As you can see in more journalistic reportage. But in poetry, I think you tend to inhabit a softer interface with the world, and that's something valuable.
But when you write about such darker aspects of human life, how do you keep the meaning of poetry as something which inspires people? As it is said that poetry is something
Yeah, yeah.
by which people get inspired in a
There
lighter
is,
note.
I've always found that actually, the more specific you get, the more universal your subject matter becomes. The more honest you are with the kind of details that you're engineering, the more sincere you are with the kind of craft you are using, along with being honest with whatever the initial feeling was which started or triggered a particular poem, the more committed you are to working through the process of editing, revising, and letting a draft breed till it becomes the 18th or the 19th draft, the more you do that, there is a way in which the bridge gets created between the person who's writing and the person who felt, and the person who's reading and the person who can feel it vicariously. So usually I find myself giving more details is the one, making it more your own is the one which creates that bridge to then a person who reads it and connects it to their own circumstances rather than um, rather than a bare text without any of those
You know,
details.
yeah.
So, and the thing is, each of these emotions which you mentioned, grief, longing, fear, all of us have felt it. All of us have felt it in different shapes. All of us have felt it vis-a-vis different people's, places, or moments in time. Uh, so your experience need not be a photocopy of my experience, and yet we'll be able to speak to each other precisely through a poem.
Yeah, like we say that somebody who wrote 500 years ago something, we can relate to it right now.
And that which stands the time of history, and that which stands the time of region, that which stands the time of language. Uh, it's precisely because in its own moment of creation it was able to create a very specific world full of detail, verisimilitude, full of a sincere commitment to expression. Yeah.
And sir, I've seen like that you translate poetry, and I have heard the your translation of Agha Shahid Ali's Stationery. So, do you think that translation is an art of preserving or reinventing?
Both. I think it's a measure of both, as several conversations during the festival today also alerted us to. Um, you know, what really excites me about translation, that one thing is the translation that we do as conscious writers, translators, who sit with a particular text and attempt to remake it in another language. But translation is also something what we do in everyday life as well.
Yeah, indeed.
The translation, I mean, we are all in our part of the world at least, if not in certain Western pockets, but in our part of the world, everyone is at least trilingual, if I'm not mistaken. All of us know at least 3 languages. We might not be able to read the scripts, but we all code switch and jump between languages without like batting an eyelid. We constantly juggle between these registers. No one says, perhaps, I mean, perhaps a lot of people say, but not enough people say, Samay kya hua hai? People say, time kya hua hai? People don't say, people say, मेरे दिल में ये ख्याल आया. People don't say, मेरे हृदय में ये विचार आया है. So there is a way in which, in regular language, in the spoken language, whether it's a mixture of Hindi, Urdu, English, Hindustani, Punjabi, which are my languages, uh, I find instead of purity, I find constantly everyday, unconscious, seamless translation constantly happening in any case. And those translations are something one lives by. Once the translation becomes an aesthetic of your working, then picking up a stationery or picking up a Langston Hughes poem or picking up an Amrita Pritam poem then becomes only an extension of that rather than this very different conscious act.
And sir, have you ever come across poetry or any text which was difficult to translate? Like you couldn't get that feeling out of it?
Well, I've worked with lots of small poems and a series of poems, but the only booklet translation that I've done is this wonderful anchor, journalist, public intellectual Ravish Kumar's Ishq Mein Sheher Hona. And this is a collection of about 88 of what he calls Laprek, Raj Kamal Prakashan, published now about a decade and a half ago. And these were his small micro love stories, is what Laghu Prem Katha, Laprek would translate to. About these two young heterosexual lovers roaming around the city of Delhi, making it their own, having all kinds of diverse experiences in that city. And so Ravish was someone who migrated from Bihar as a young person, went to study in JNU and Delhi University, and then becomes one of the most eloquent and sensitive journalists in our country. So, in translating it, I remember making lots of phone calls to my college friends who were from Bihar. And so that because I didn't want to get the register wrong, and I didn't want to impose this Punjabi migrant to Lucknow who grew up in this city, that lehza onto his poetry, because it had a different kind of alladpan, it had a different kind of verve. So I remember, so not difficult but joyous, like not difficult but something that you had to work in, not difficult but something that you had to constantly revise.
To have it right.
Yeah. And I remember making multiple phone calls to both my friends from Bihar, and also because Ravish's partner, to whom the book is dedicated, is from Bengal. So also to some of my Bengali friends, because there's some of the Bengali words which also seamlessly entered his storytelling.
So, when you started writing poetry, were there any writers or poets which were your role models?
I mean, several. The poet that I really looked up to was someone called Dorothy Parker. She wrote between 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s in New York. She wrote about very dark subject matters. It could be about betrayal, it could be about loss, it could be about even thoughts of self-harm, and yet she wrote it about in with humor. And that capacity for her humor to engage with such dark subject matters was something that I all constantly looked up to. I found it very hard to do. And I think you start by trying to imitate people. So Dorothy Parker is someone I constantly try to imitate. But soon enough, I found that someone, because you mentioned grief longing earlier, someone who constantly, mostly throughout his life, wrote in the elegiac kind of mode was this Kashmiri American poet Agha Shahid Ali, who you mentioned shortly before. And in the 70s when he wrote about the loss of Begum Akhtar, whose mazar is here. He wrote in the 90s, he wrote 80s and 90s, he wrote about what was happening in his homeland in Kashmir, which was going through an extremely difficult time. And in the late 90s, he passed away in 2001, shortly after. In the late 90s, what he said, the biggest subject matter happened, which was the loss of his mother. And there is a way in which that the moment the subject matter becomes the most difficult for him, even the forms in which he's writing, canzones, sestinas, ghazals, villanelles, these kind of old European forms, which is old European and old Arabo-Persian Urdu forms, which he's picking up. I think there is a way and he was able to evolve a difficult register of language because precisely the subject matter was difficult. Difficult not in the sense that you won't understand it, difficult in the sense that it attained the intensity of emotions that you and I feel when we feel what happens in our life. So I think the humor of Dorothy Parker and the meditativeness and the cultural immersiveness and the sheer effort at poetic form and craft of Agha Shahid Ali. These are the two poets who I really admire and have continued to admire.
And does your writing imitate them in the current time?
I'm sure like now one is so absorbed in their writing that there is a way in which after a point you wouldn't even able to filter out what mine is from them. But like there is a way and I constantly go back to their work. In the 1926 I believe was a first collection called Enough Rope. And Shahid wrote, he was a young student at Hindu College where I also studied. He taught English literature there as well for about 5 years before he migrated to the US, and he remained there for the rest of his life, visiting Kashmir each year and Delhi often. So he came to Lucknow once as well because he was very close friends with Salim Kidwai, very, very close friends with Salim Kidwai, who is a very prized historian who we lost recently. So I believe, I don't think their influence will ever leave me. Yeah, I'm sure, perhaps I'm so unconscious of it, but I think this, one of the ways in which I do note it very specifically is that constantly toggling between English, Hindi, Urdu, Punjabi. And that capacity, I think Shahid does in his poetry as well.
Yeah, indeed. And when I read your poetry, I could see the similarities between you and Agha Shahid Ali.
That's the hope. That thrills me a lot that you say that. Secretly, I'm very thrilled.
And sir, as you are a literature professor, you were in Delhi before and now you shifted to Mumbai bits. So do you see a difference between students just because of the cities they perceive literature differently?
No, I don't think, because the students themselves are coming from very different places.
Yeah.
So if you're talking about what is the kind of literary culture we form once they enter the university, that depends more on us than on the students. Because when I was in Delhi University and I taught in Ramjas College, SGTB Khalsa College, Stephens College, and then I taught in two other universities in Delhi. One was a state university called Ambedkar University, which is bang in the center of walled city, Kashmiri Gate, and another called Shiv Nadar University, which was very much outside Delhi NCR in Dadri. So there were very different kind of literary cultures which evolved in each of those places. A private university had a very affluent body of students with very little social diversity, but fair amount of demographic diversity. A Delhi University class had people from all different walks of life and all very different social locations. So I think it doesn't really, I don't think there are any implicit differences between different cities. I think it's what the university makes of them. Right now I teach in a law school. I teach literature to law students. So it's a very different kind of a beast. It's very different ends of the conversations. There's also a great amount of excitement because it's not their exact discipline, but it's a subject meant to expand the horizons of their mind. So also they take to it very warmly. So I think it depends more on the teacher rather than, I don't think they are coming with because I teach undergraduates and postgraduates. The undergraduates are not coming with a very set idea of how we will
Yes,
read or what we
exactly.
will rely on. It's just that, but Delhi and Bombay offer you so many literary traditions that you can be a part of.
Indeed.
You know, in Bombay, you can refer to a Kolatkar who wrote equally felicitously between Marathi and English.
English.
In Delhi, you can equally
Urdu.
have like immense literary traditions to rely on.
And sir, as a literature professor, so to undergraduate students, what would you recommend to read them? Because I think we are still stuck at Shakespeare, and there are so many other writers we should be exploring, but we are not for many reasons due to university syllabus curriculum. So, what writers would you like to suggest?
One of the advice that worked really well for me, but which my teachers and my peers told me, is to read contemporary writers, like writers who are living and breathing now in whichever language. So, and also to not think of literature in one language as necessarily better than in other languages. Though we know that the language of social mobility and aspiration continues to remain English, and everyone should have a stake in it. But in whichever level of comfort and expertise you have in whichever languages, to cultivate that rather than ignore others in favor of only one, and to read living writers. The moment you develop taste in who are the people living and breathing today who we admire, you create a very a nuanced literary bent of mind, rather than relying, as you say, Shakespeare is a very valuable source of text, but I think the way you're using that word, you're also symbolizing that, rather than get stuck in only one kind of English canon.
Exactly,
But the thing
being
is,
stuck at dead white men.
so, and there is the world outside, the world of dead white men, as you and I both know very well.
So, are there some writers, contemporary writers, you would like to suggest?
I mean, so some of the Hindi and Urdu writers who I really admire. So there's a poet called Shubham Shri. One of her poems called Poetry Management. Several others on Kavita Kosh. There's an enormous amount of work that you can see and read of hers. Shubham Shri, she writes wonderfully. There are two poets who are based in my city, Hussain Haidari and Amir Aziz. Particularly during the NRC CA protests, there the way they spoke about the world was evocative, was full of intervention, and was full of an investment for what kind of world they wish to see in the world. Another Lucknow poet who I really like is Sabika Abbas Naqvi. She performs quite regularly in the city, and the way various languages of her inheritance mix in her poetry is something that I constantly admire. So, I mean, these are the Hindi Urdu poets who I really like, and these are fairly young poets. The Hindi Urdu canon, I'm sure people are already familiar with. It's a one Google search away. But if they read Shubham Shri, Hussain Haidari, Amir Aziz, Sabika Abbas Naqvi, I think there's something very promising which they can gain from it.
Yes, sir. And what advice would you like to give to people who want to start writing poetry, but maybe they're not able to express it pretty well with their words?
I mean, two things. One is that if you want to write good poetry, you have to read good
Read
poetry.
good poetry.
So there is correct me if I'm wrong, but some people have a mistaken notion that reading other people's work will corrupt their mind. So in order to write original work, they should stop reading other people. So that is a very perverse way of looking at the world. So if you want to attempt to write good poetry, persuasive poetry, then you surround yourself with good and persuasive poetry. That's one. The other is just willingness to revise. I mean, write a poem, show it to three friends, or three teachers, or some people you trust, get their feedback. You don't need to agree with all of the feedback, but if something doesn't quite work for all three of them, then there might be a matter in the poem. Then willing to edit and revise. I think if you read good work and if you're willing to edit and revise your work, there's nothing like that to. And by the end of that process, and by the end of some years, you'll be producing poetry which is true, authentic, persuasive, and which is able to say something unique in the world.
And sir, as I was reading your poetry, so I mostly saw that those poems were very short. Like, I might be wrong, or maybe I just read the short ones, but Edgar Allan Poe once said that a long poem makes the meaning get lost in it. The shorter the poem, the better it is. So, what is your take on that?
So I think they involve very different kinds of faculties. I mean, there is a long poem has lots of actually advantages in the sense that you are allowed to be meditative. You're allowed to come back to certain images, certain words. You're able to create cycles of feelings the way you actually feel in real life, and a long poem can hold those feelings. And the way sometimes we wrestle with things that haunt us for a long time, and the long poem is able to mime it. Whereas a short poem, like it has its own capacities, like it's epigrammatic, it's crisp, it's brilliant, it's able to deliver a punch, it's able to say something which creates a sudden insight. So I attempt both. I believe short poems do travel more, like particularly on social media and other
Yes,
forums.
yes.
Like, short poems travel more, they have a greater mobility, so perhaps people end up reading more short poems. But equally, one attempts longer poems, and they mostly make it to books rather than digital
Digital.
forums. But I think the idea is that you have to keep both those faculties alive. You have to not let the form of the social media, which necessarily prefers a shorter poem, sway you only in one direction, even as you enjoy all the prospects and the what do you call it, dividends that a short poem pays. Yeah.
And sir, as you're a poet, you must have maybe once in your life faced creative or writer's block. So, what would you like to say about it?
So, thankfully, I can't think of any long period in which such a feeling jarred me or completely stopped any kind of expression. But what I do enjoy and what I do find was really, really helpful is when you can't write a poem on your own or you can't write a short story on your own, I translate it. And at that point, you relied on others, you tipped your hat to others, you observed how they are doing what they are doing, and whether it was translating Ravish Kumar, or whether it was translating Aga Shahid Ali or Dorothy Parker or Amrita Pritam, that's how you return to your own voice. You always, a lot of poets that I admire, Seamus Heaney and others, a lot of poets that I admire say that you find your own voice reflected in the voice of others. So I think writer's block is easily decimated if you're also a translator, because you remain in the company of words and letters. And if you remain a good company, वो सोहबत का असर हो जाता है, and you end up writing yourself.
So, being a literature student, it was really nice talking to a literature professor. I'm also pursuing my undergrad from Lucknow only.
Wonderful.
So, it was really nice talking to you.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you so
Thank you
much.
so much.